We have 4 questions to address from the Bible reading plan today. 1 from the Old Testament, 3 from the New Testament. First one comes from the book of Exodus and says, why does the Lord harden Pharaoh's heart so many times in Exodus 7 through 14? Back in chapter 4 of Exodus, verse 21, we read this. The Lord told Moses, I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. God previews the fact that he would harden Pharaoh's heart so that he would be kept from allowing the people of Israel to leave Egypt. Then in chapter 7, right before the first plague comes, we read the same exact language. Exodus 7 verses 3 and 4 says, but I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my host, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. So there's this mighty act of the Lord through his powerful hand that would move Pharaoh to eventually allow the people to go out. But why keep them in? Well, really quickly, here's what we read when we scan through the first 6 plagues. So plague number 1, the water turned to blood. And we read in chapter 7, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. Number 2, the frog family reunion in the land of Egypt. And it says Pharaoh hardened his heart. Then the gnats invade. And we read that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Then the invasion of the flies. Pharaoh hardened his heart in chapter 8. Then the livestock die. The heart of Pharaoh was hardened, chapter 9. And then the 6th plague that came, the plague of the boils, we read, the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. Then when we come to plague 7, the hail, things get really, really interesting in the description. We read in chapter 9, verses 15 and 16, the Lord speaking to Pharaoh, for by now I could have put you out of my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, and you would have been cut off from the earth. In other words, you would have died. But for this purpose, I have raised you up to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all of the earth. There's the answer. That's what the Apostle Paul quotes from in Romans chapter 9, where he reiterates the same reason, same answer to the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, that the Lord's name may be proclaimed in all of the earth. So God placed Pharaoh in a powerful position to accomplish his purposes. He preserved Pharaoh's life to accomplish his purposes. He hardened his heart to accomplish his purposes, ultimately to show his power and to see his glory, his name spread across the earth unto the nations. And I also want to point out, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, but Pharaoh still had sinful culpability before the Lord. There was a clear turning of Pharaoh's heart without the influence of the Lord. Pharaoh hardened his heart. Pharaoh hardened his heart, showing us that sinful bent of Pharaoh's heart to begin with. So the Lord took that sinful bent, he hardened it further to use Pharaoh and his sinfulness to accomplish his purposes. And certainly, there's a divine mystery there as we see that God is glorified even in his judgment of sinful people. But there's an equal divine mystery in the mercy that he chooses to freely give to his children who also deserve divine wrath, yet we are given grace. So there's this divine mystery at work both in his judgment and in his salvation of his people. The bottom line of Scripture is everyone is born sinful. We are all dead in our trespasses and sin. But as we saw previewed last Sunday's sermon in Ezekiel chapter 36, not only does the Lord give us his own Spirit, he gives us a new heart. And that's what's pictured ultimately, the power of God to spread his name at work in the hardening of Pharaoh. Second question from the New Testament comes from the book of Matthew. It says, after healing the demon-possessed men, why did the townspeople beg Jesus to leave their region? In Matthew 8, verse 34. Before I read the verse, little recap. Jesus goes into this region. There's two demon-possessed men who met him there, coming out of the tombs, and they were very powerful. They were possessed by a legion of demons, we read, and the demons begged him to not cast them out, but to instead send them into a herd of pigs. So Jesus did. He cast them out of the men, sent them into the herd of pigs. The herd of pigs throws themselves over a cliff, and they die. And the people are basically freaked out in the town. And it says in verse 34, all the city came out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they begged him to leave their region. I think there's certainly a fear on the side of the people, but on a much more basic, simplistic, tangible level, they ruined this pig farmer's livelihood. All of his livestock were dead on the side of this cliff, and I think they were fearful for what he would do to the rest of the townsfolk. Yes, he may solve the demon problem, but what's he going to do to their livelihood? And so they asked him to leave on that account. The other two questions come from Acts 16, both of them. The first one is, why is there a change from second-person pronouns they in Acts 16:6 and prior to the first person we in Acts 16 verse 10? This is a very astute question, good observation, but it shows us that Luke, who was writing the book of Acts, Luke actually wrote more of the New Testament than any other New Testament author, even Paul, because the length of Luke and Acts, which go together longer than any other single author's New Testament writings. Apparently Luke, on a couple of different occasions, joined with Paul or some of the other apostles and journeyed with him on their missionary journeys. And when he did, he started writing in the first person. We did this. We did that. We went here. So keep an eye out for it because we'll see it later on in the chapter. Second question is, why would Paul circumcise Timothy in Acts 16 right after the events of Acts 15, where the Jerusalem council had decided not to hold such observance of the law over the Gentiles? What we have to recognize is there's really two different situations going on between Acts 16 and Acts 15. In Acts 15, the big issue was the requirement of circumcision for the Gentiles' salvation. So there was an understanding or an argument that in order to be saved, Gentiles had to be circumcised. In Acts 16 with Timothy, it's different. It's the circumcision of this half-Jew. Timothy's mother was Jewish, his father was a Gentile, and so the influence of his father probably kept him from being being circumcised as a child. So when Paul had Timothy circumcised, he wasn't doing this to try and meet a requirement of the law in order to obtain salvation. He was having him circumcised in order to tear down barriers between his fellow Jews and the gospel presentation. Later in Galatians 2, when the Jews protested that Titus, a Gentile, was not circumcised, Paul rejected their argument and did not force Titus to be circumcised as a requirement of salvation. He instead here with Timothy is saying, in order to try and reach the Jews for salvation, let's have Timothy get circumcised. Paul reveals his modus operandi to us, his manner of operation in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 22, where he says that to the Jews he became a Jew, to the Gentile became a Gentile, so that he would in any way reach those with the gospel of Jesus Christ. In fact, we see the same pattern later in Acts 21, verses 17 through 26, where Paul goes along with some other Old Covenant regulations, but again, for the purpose of removing an offense to the gospel, but he never, ever ties Old Testament regulations to the saving work of the gospel. Hope that helps. Keep reading, church.